welcome to DeKalb History Center's Lunch and Learn, February 22. It's good to see so many people here in person, and we are hopefully streaming live, and there are people out there watching as well. We're happy to have Judge Clarence Seeliger here with us today to talk about his collection and his work. So we'll go through slides that relate to his collection and his work. As you can see in the first slide here, we met Judge Seeliger back in November of 2020 and started collecting boxes. This is just part of the boxes here. There were probably 10 or 12 on the other side of the room that we didn't photograph. So it was a really huge collection, and we're so happy to have it here in the archives, and we're so glad to have Judge Seeliger here in person with these slides as we go along. And I am Jennifer Blomqvist. I am the archivist here at the History Center. Mike? I'm so sorry. Is it mic 1? Is that better? Oh, yeah. Way better. That works. Sorry about that, guys. So we're going to get started. I was going to let you know that, so we got to have Judge Seeliger's collection here in November 2020, but he has been part of the History Center's work for decades. So I was doing a little bit of digging and found that, Judge Seeliger, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've been a member here of the History Center since at least the 80s. I found a letter in the collection from 82. He was here in 85 again. He was here in 2005 for an oral history called Minority Bar in the courthouse. He was here in 2012 doing an oral history, change and transformation in the courts. He was here in October 2021 doing a one-on-one interview with me that we recorded for our YouTube channel. So he has been a part of the History Center's work and what we've been doing for a long time. And we're so glad you're here once again, and we're so glad to have your collection with us. Judge Seeliger, and I can't believe I haven't asked this question of you before, sir, but can you talk about the fact that obviously you were a judge, you retired from Superior Court in 2020, but you were also a state court judge. Can you talk about the difference between those two courts?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And since I'm no longer a judge, you can probably ask me anything you want. So if you've got any questions about any of the controversial cases I have handled over the years, all judges have handled them, of course, I can probably speak it. Can't hear it. It's not loud. Can you hear me now? Nope.
New technology. Yes, some of this technology is new to us very recently, so we are working out kinks as we do it, so I apologize for the while we're waiting, I will go ahead and, for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with Judge Seeliger, I do have his bio that he wrote back in this is a letter that you wrote to someone in Washington State, where you're from, and this was written in 2000. This gives the highlights of Judge Seeliger. So he graduated from the University of Washington and entered the Air Force in 1963. While he was in the Air Force, he served in places such as Savannah, Georgia, Biloxi, Mississippi, and Vietnam. He began Emory University in 1968, where he was a law student involved in the civil rights movement, primarily with the Southern Regional Council and working for African Americans for office. We're going to talk about one of those candidates very shortly. Finished law school and became an attorney, and then a state judge, and then a Superior Court judge. There's your highlights. Judge, you want to talk about state court and Superior Court differences? If your mic is better.
See, can you hear me at all?
No.
Nope. try it again. Any luck? No.
Material that you'll see today is really just a small, tiny sampling of what is involved in Judge Seeliger's collection. His entire collection takes up 25 document boxes, and we have 33, no, I'm sorry, I put that back. We have 33 document boxes and 25 scrapbooks from Judge Seeliger. So any of this material that you're interested in, you will need to make an appointment to come and see me and see the material up close. But this is such a small, we only have an hour today, so this is just a small sampling of what is contained within his collection. Also check out our website, YouTube channel. Judge Seeliger, as I mentioned, has been here several times before talking about his work and others. So those are available on our YouTube channel as well. So just a couple of things to keep in mind as we proceed. Okay, Judge.
Can you hear me now? Somebody did a commercial about that at one point.
A little closer. You need to get a little bit closer to the mic. That's
All right. Well, I was elected to the state court in the 1980s. My first day of work was on January the 1st, 1981. And that's a story all by itself. But briefly, I've joined the state court. Now, the state court has changed from what it was in 1981 to what it is today. The state court then was basically a small claims court on civil side. It handled criminal cases, misdemeanors, like driving under the influence cases, possessions of alcohol, simple battery, simple assault, shoplifting, minor sort, and the like. It was then in 1983 it changed. The Constitution of Georgia changed it and gave the state court jurisdiction over civil cases with no limitation. Before, they had a limitation of handling cases that didn't claim more than $10,000. Now, they handle the majority of the major civil cases that take place in the DeKalb County and indeed throughout the entire state. So your major medical malpractice cases, cases of major injury and the like are now in the state court. In 1985, I began my service as a Superior Court judge. The Superior Court judge has a certain jurisdiction that anyway, but Superior Court has first of all, it has jurisdiction over domestic relations cases, so it's become in many respects a divorce court, as well as a criminal court. And in the criminal cases, of course, they handle the most serious cases, everything from murder, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and the like. And so the Superior Court now, at least in DeKalb County, is largely domestic relations on the civil side, and of course criminal. And then the other side they have power is injunctive powers, that under certain circumstances a judge can do things like, well, like for example, stopping the building of the Presidential Parkway, which I did in 1985. It's a limited power. DeKalb County and Superior Court judges are courts of equity. That is, they make those decisions not under the common law, although they are governed by such laws that have been decided, and that can only be appealed to the Supreme Court of Georgia. So that's the basic difference. There are lots of others, but that, I think, sums it up.
Fantastic. Thank you. We'll move on. So, you mentioned, or I mentioned in the bio that I read from, that you obviously were involved in civil rights issues when you moved to DeKalb County, and items in our collection. It's a paper from Maynard Jackson's run for U.S. Senate, and this was, and there's a photograph that's from a different collection. But Judge Seeliger worked for Maynard Jackson's campaign, and I was wondering, Judge, if you would mind doing a brief talk about your work with Maynard Jackson and his run for Senate.
Well, the summer of 1968 was a pivotal experience in my life. The first 1967, I started law school at Emory. I completed my first year, then I decided to become an intern with the Southern Regional Council, where they paid a small amount of money for students, law students in this case, to work with the Southern Regional Council. And the Southern Regional Council was basically collection of data about race relations in the South. But it became a home to a lot of people who were involved in the Civil Rights Movement. When I walked in the door of the Southern Regional Council, I met some people, and they didn't know quite what to do with me. So I kind of wandered around like a student, my first year of law school, and I recognized two people sitting at a desk, and they were Julian Bond and John Lewis. Now, Julian and John had just been deposed. They had been presidents of the Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were both had been deposed by Stokely Carmichael, and so they had moved to Atlanta, and as a lot of civil rights people did at that time, and they got involved with the Southern Regional Council, and they were ostensibly writing stories about the registration of African Americans to vote, which would be central in 1968, because the Voting Rights Act, would give African Americans a real opportunity to vote, was passed in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so they thought this was a great opportunity to start registering African American voters. And Julian was involved with that, and John was involved with that. At the same time, when I walked out of that office and went down for lunch, I got out of the elevator, and who should be there but Maynard Jackson. Now, Maynard had taught poverty law at Emory Law School, and he and I was not in any of his classes, but we got to know each other. I meet him outside, and we talked. And for all I knew, when we finished school that time, that summer, he was going to be preparing to head up the poverty law program for Emory University. But when I got on the elevator with Maynard, he looked at me and he said, "Chuck, I'm going to run for the United States Senate against Herman Talmadge. Will you help me?" I thought, wait a minute. So I had to think about that, because when I went and talked to Paul Anthony, who was the director of the Southern Regional Council, and I gave him a sales pitch. The pitch was, look, Maynard's going to be the first African-American to run statewide in Georgia since Reconstruction. And it's going to be a bid to encourage African-American voters for the first time for someone that's one of their own. And I think it'd be very important for me to involve myself with it. Would you let me do that? They had no objection. And so I worked on Maynard's campaign. In the meantime, well, I'll tell two stories. First, talk about Maynard's campaign. When I first got into it, I started doing the statistical workouts to show where he should campaign, using results of other elections that had happened. People like Jimmy Carter, when he had run for the state senate. Another state races were arguably, so they were liberals and and secondly, where there was a large concentration of African American voters. And I put it together statistically, and that became the guideline for the campaign to send Maynard when he traveled throughout the state of Georgia. I was an advance man for him on a couple of those trips. First trip we went down to Tolliver County. A farmer by the name of Calvin Turner, really kind of a magnetic kind of guy, was trying to run a voter registration program down there. So we went down there, and when we showed up, we spoke in an open field. I was standing on the back of a trailer, and Maynard was as well. And he made a speech to approximately 1,000 people, all African American, of course. There were a few whites, but some of those whites were kind of scary because they were taking pictures. You couldn't figure out whether they were from the Talmadge campaign or the FBI or whatever. You had no idea who they were, but they were just taking pictures. When I tried to introduce myself, they just ignored me. That be that as it may, he made a speech, then I made a follow-up speech about how to register to vote and the like. And then we headed down to Louisville, which was about 60 miles away. And there was a big rally at a church. It was a typical African-American church, large. Everybody's dressed to the nines, coats and ties for the men, hats for the women. And Maynard made a dynamite speech. He really did well. The funnier thing that happened after that is that Maynard, the pastor came up to the microphone and said, "Now, we're going to take up a collection for Maynard's campaign, and we want you to contribute. I don't want to hear the rattle of coins that would jar my attention. All I want to hear is a soft filling of bills he placed in the little these baskets that were passed around." They came in and they raised quite a bit of money. I don't know how much it was. So we left there and we went to a gas station. Leaving an all-black environment, going to an all-white environment at that time in 1968, that was kind of a shock. But anyway, we pulled up and Maynard got pulled in. He had a guy driving him. He had a Chevy 2, I believe it was. And he walked in and he went in, and this was a place that was kind of a creamery. It had an ice cream place there as well as a gas station. And there are all kinds of people sitting around, even white folks, older white folks, and the like. And Maynard had the guts of a cat burglar. He went up to each one of them and said, "I'm Maynard Jackson, I'm running for the United States Senate." People kind of shrank away from him. They'd never seen a black candidate before. But they followed him, and then I went up to the cash register after he paid his bill. And he said, a guy says, "You think this boy stands a chance?" "Yeah, I think Maynard's got a chance." Threw it off. Meanwhile, I was looking outside the window, and there were these 4 kids. I mean, they're high school kids, I think. And they got into a Cadillac, into an Oldsmobile, an old one. The Oldsmobile at that time, pretty identifiable if you were to get followed by one. They had 4 headlights. It was one of those, I think it must have been 1975 or 76 when they had these quadrant lights. Be that as it may, I forgot to mention, when we went into the gas station, about 50 or 60 of the people who had been at the service that we just left got in there as well. And all of a sudden I realized they were there to protect us. They were watching everything that was going on. And if any of these white folks wanted to do something to Maynard, they'd have to do it in front of a whole lot of witnesses. And these people were determined. So Maynard left, got in his car and left, and I got in my car driving a Volkswagen. We went on, and then a trail of cars with headlights followed us all the way. It must have been 30 cars, only the people from the service. And then we reached the turn off to Highway 17, I believe, going south to Savannah, because that's where we were headed. And they turned off after honking their horns and waving, and I waved them off, and we went on. And then about 2 minutes later, I saw a car coming fast behind me. It was that Oldsmobile with the quadrant lights. It approached me, tailgated me. I flashed my lights in case Maynard, who was about 500 yards away from me, and so I know that these people might mean hostility towards me. They followed me for a minute, and then they swung around to the side, and they shoved me off the road. Volkswagen did not flip. I was really surprised at that. I was in the gulch, in the gulch, but I was able to get out. And Maynard had waited at the turnoff up ahead, wondering what had happened to me. I pulled up and I said, "I'm fine. Did you see those kids?" And he said, "Yeah, they passed us. They didn't do anything." I said, "Okay." I did tell Maynard about it after the campaign. At that time, we were all kind of tense and didn't think it would be a good idea. So we then went on down to Savannah, went to restaurants, we went to churches and the like, just like we did. And then down to Brunswick. And then from Brunswick, I left. Maynard went on to, I believe it was LaGrange, and I was to go back to Atlanta. So I went to Columbus and then started driving up the old Highway 85. I had a bunch of campaign signs on the back of my car. I had brought them from, I've been putting them up from time to time all over the state. But this Highway 85, I-85 was a 2-lane road at that point. So I pulled over to the side and started putting, illegally of course, signs on the Georgia Power signs. I always say, don't put in signs on it, so I put them up there. And for almost a mile, every 500 yards I put up one of these signs. And then I finally went to this last location. I had one more sign left, I put it up. And again, white teenagers pulled up behind my car. I was above them, sitting on a kind of a hillock where the signs were located. And they got out, and they walked up to me, and they started, please forgive me for saying what they were saying, but they called me nigger, lover, this, that, and the other thing. And they were looking for trouble. They really were threatening. I had one thing that they didn't have, though. Number one, I had a stapling gun, like yay big. It was through my hand. I was picking that up with the signs. The other thing is that they didn't know. I was 27 years old. I just went through a war. I was not a little boy. They may have thought I was a candy-ass liberal from New York City, but I wasn't. And when they made boot on me, they surrounded me. And I took that stapling gun, the guy in front of me, and swung it at him. I missed him, and he hit the ground. But everybody else was stunned. They had no idea that I was going to react that way. I stepped over him, and walked down to the car. And they followed after me, using the chanting, nigger over this, nigger over that, and so on. And I got in the car, back to Atlanta. In Atlanta, Maynard did very, very well. But when the election took place, he lost. But what he'd done, I think, accomplished his purpose. I wrote an article for the Southern Regional Council's magazine called, I forgot what the name of the magazine was, an account of the campaign and how he had done. And it turned out that he got just about all of the votes he was going to get in rural Georgia from the African-American community. And it was pretty impressive. In 1969, after I was back into law school, Maynard ran for vice mayor. And I volunteered as a part-timer because I was, as I say, was in law school at the time. So I worked as kind of his night manager for his headquarters, which is in downtown Atlanta. Maynard won, and 3 years later he would run for mayor. Now, the other two people I met were Julian Bond and John Lewis. They got to be pretty good friends of John. And Julian, of course, for those of you who know, and I think some of you may have known him, he's a very distant kind of guy. He's hard to get talked to. He's a great sense of humor, but it's very hard to get close to Julian. So we're never really all that close. But he was really good at speaking, and of course, he's a really bright guy. But the two of them were involved in another campaign that I wasn't involved in, except as an observer. They're trying to put together a channels delegation for the 1968 Democratic Convention. At that time, Governor Lester Maddox had appointed all of his delegates, which were all male, all white, to the Democratic Convention. So they put together the channels convention. They met at the Dempsey Hotel down in Macon, and lots of union organizations and civil rights organizations got together, and they named this delegation. And then they went to the convention, and there were all kinds of things that happened at the convention, but not too well known now. But the challenge delegation was successful. They became the new delegation representing Georgia in the Democratic Party, the convention. And if you may recall, some of you may recall, Julian Bond actually got nominated for vice president, but he couldn't take the position, take the nomination because he was 32 years old, and you have to be 35 to be Julian didn't go on to other things. He worked in academics, made a lot of speeches. He was working for the Democratic Party as a central forces speaker. John Lewis came back to Atlanta and ran the Voter Education Project, which was a subsidiary of the Southern Regional Council, basically funding voter registration programs throughout the South. John would later run for city council in Wayne, and I wasn't involved in his campaign, but I was an observer. He was a friend. And then in 1987 or 88, John decided to run for Congress, and so did Julian. And that campaign broke my heart because Julian and John are both good friends. Well, John won. And Julian went off to the University of Virginia, where he started teaching. He also was later, as I'm sure many of you were, president of the National NAACP. And John, of course, is great, has become a pivotal congressman in until he passed away last year. I would be in contact with John from time to time. When I won the election in 1981 against Oscar Mitchell, he was so pleased. He showed up at the campaign headquarters and said great things about me and all kinds of stuff. I don't think it was all true, but that's okay. I like compliments anyway. So anyway, thereafter I'd see him from time to time. But the last time I saw him was 3 years ago. He with two guys had written a history of his life, an action comic book that they had put together. They were the artists, and they told John's life from the time he was born in the Alabama farm up to the present when he was in Congress. And I liked Congress, and I wanted to see him. So I knew they were having a book signing over in Ansley Park. So I went over there and waited in line with everybody else, bought a copy of the book. I approached it. John looked up and he said, "Judge," and he ran around the table and grabbed me. Said a few words, and he signed the book and said some nice things in it. That's the last time I saw him. Anyway, that's 1968.
The picture I put on the screen is the magazine you referred to, or the book you referred to. It's called New South, and the title of the article you wrote is Postmortem of the Georgia Primary. And we have that as part of your collection. Now you mentioned Vietnam, you also mentioned Jimmy Carter. Here's a picture of you with some very familiar people. Max Cleland is there in the front row, and Jimmy Carter. It looks like a swearing-in ceremony. Can you talk a little bit about your work with the Vietnam Veterans Organization, Jimmy Carter?
When I opened my office, after I graduated from law school, I worked for another lawyer for a year in Bucky. I decided I wanted to open an office in Decatur, and a good friend of mine, Jim Bonner, he and I had been roommates in law school, decided to get together and set up a partnership. It wasn't going to last very long because Jim was a great student. He was a wonderful appellate lawyer. He eventually, 6 months after we started trying to establish a partnership, he went off to the University of Georgia where he handled the appeals section for the law school. He did lots of criminal appeals pro bono through the University of Georgia's handling program. So there I was, and by myself, with another Amos Worth, a retired Army colonel who had also set up offices there, and Mary Whiteman, who is one of the, I think at that time, one of 3 women lawyers practicing in DeKalb County in 1971. And down the hall was a fellow by the name of Bert Westbrook. Bert is kind of notorious. He was a Vietnam veteran, graduate of West Point on his way up. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was a captain on his way to be promoted to major. He went to Vietnam and he went there for a year. He received he was decorated with several, I think a Silver Star and a couple other awards. And then the Pentagon decided they wanted to send him back. And he said no, he wouldn't go. And unlike other people who were draftees, or like me, for example, he didn't want to go. He could resign his commission because he was a regular officer in the Army, and he did. And he became famous. It's kind of written up in the Washington Post newspaper as a Vietnam veteran who was opposed to the Vietnam War. He came south. He was from Atlanta, and opened an office of some sort in the Masonic Temple building. It's right over here. I think most of you know where it is. There used to be a bank. SunTrust used to be there. Now it's basically it has offices upstairs. So I ran into Bert and I started talking to him. He told me background. I told him that's a Vietnam veteran. All that. And he said, well, you know, we're forming a campaign for Governor Carter's called Governor's Committee on Vietnam Veterans and MIA. So you want to serve on it? I said, well, what are we going to do? He says, we're just going to look into the plight of Vietnam veterans coming back to Georgia. And this was in 1972. And at that time, I think a figure that I heard, we were close to 600,000 Georgians who were Vietnam veterans. Not many people realize how expansive that war was. Apparently, 8 million people served in and around Vietnam and Thailand and in this country in support during the Vietnam era from 1970, let's see, it would be from 1964 until we left the war in 1976. And then it's 1972 and there were still hostilities going on. So at any event, I went down there, Max Cleveland would be the chair of it and meet, and then they go off and do investigations. And we had one here, and since I was the only lawyer on there, he asked me to set up a hearing with various officials from the Veterans let's see, the Department of Veterans Affairs for the state of Georgia, and so on, to get an idea, and veterans, and what kinds of problems they were having upon their return. And I got involved with that. I listened to them. I asked a lot of questions, listened to the plight of the vets. I knew a little bit about the problems because I had problems with the VA myself, getting my payments, student payments, when I was going to law school. But the Department of Veterans Affairs was contracted out from the Veterans Administration to provide veteran services outside of Atlanta and all over the rural areas. And they were doing an abysmal job. These guys would start school on the understanding that they would receive their payments and they wouldn't get them. So that became one of the major bones of contention there. When they're asked to present legislation, proposed legislation for the benefit of Vietnam, proposed, not by me, but other members of the committee, that we ought to have free tuition for Vietnam veterans, or for veterans, at the University of Georgia. They had to be otherwise qualified, they had to be academically qualified, to be given free tuition. My real disappointment was that the other veterans organizations, like the American Legion and the like, opposed it. They felt that that would give an added benefit that they didn't get when they came back from Vietnam or from Korea. They didn't want to see the Vietnam veterans get any more. Of course, the difference was that the federal benefits that you get from the VA were much less than for those veterans of World War II and the Korean War. I didn't seem to cut any ice with them. And all the Vietnam veterans on this committee, and there were 21 people on the committee, 10 of which were Vietnam veterans. So we had a hearing. And we were to meet to make the presentation of our report to Governor Carter, and it was a televised meeting of some sort. I appeared, and I was asked by the other members to make a presentation of a dissenting report, which said what we felt the legislature ought to do. It caught Governor Carter completely off guard. Something had happened between me and Governor Carter several times in the next few years, but be that as it may. He listened to the report and our minority report, and that just about ended it. That was the end of it. I did speak at a couple of veterans organizations, Vietnam veteran organizations thereafter, but there wasn't much more after.
Interested in reading and seeing more about Judge Seeliger's interactions with President Carter as it relates to the Presidential Parkway. That is also part of this collection. If we had more time, I would have Judge Seeliger to go through that story too, but it's very interesting. So check that out. I'm going to scroll through a few more slides. We're not going to touch on everything, but again, these are all available as part of Judge Seeliger's collection. So you had a meeting, or you got to meet Stacey Abrams. This letter was from 2007, and you were both at the DeKalb Lawyers Breakfast, and you were talking about the Georgia Commission on Family Violence, which you were a part of for quite a while. Can you talk about that commission?
Well, I'd love it to.
And or Stacey Abrams.
Okay. Let's see, in 1984, I sentenced my first defendant who had beaten up his wife when I was a state court judge. I put him on probation. Sadly, in domestic violence cases, sometimes it still happens. Judges and juries don't pay much attention to victims of domestic violence. Don't seem to accept that these things can happen. Well, I saw it. I saw what it did to these people. And so I became very interested in the issue. And so I joined, for a short time, the DeKalb volunteer lawyers. The DeKalb Committee against domestic violence. It was a local group made up of prosecutors, judges. Actually, I was the only judge, and police officers, investigators, district attorneys, and even some public defenders. The whole idea was to investigate and to encourage prosecution of people who abused women and some men during the course of their relationship. I became chair of that operation in 1981 in DeKalb County. Then in 1991, excuse me. And then in 1993, I was asked by some people in the State Commission if I'd be willing to be chair of the State Commission on Family Violence. And I agreed. It was kind of a put-up job. I didn't really know what was going to happen. We all met in the governor's office, and Joe Frank Harris was governor. He wasn't available, so we were sworn in by one of the staff members. That was all right. And then everybody came together to meet and said, well, we've got to elect a new chair. So who's it going to be? Somebody nominated me. I said, wait a minute, I don't know you people. You sure you want me to be a chair? He says, you a judge? Yes. You're the chair. I became chair. And I got very interested in it, and I stayed, and I served until 2001, for about 6 years. I just stayed chair of the State Commission. I also drafted a law, a portion of the law, a very small portion of the law, dealing with domestic violence in 1989. It was presented by Kathy Steinberg, who was at that time in the legislature, and I helped draft a portion of that language of that law. It passed. And it's still good law. It says basically that if someone is abused and is found by preponderance of evidence to have taken place, you can issue a restraining order against the abuser, take his guns, and basically the first law that had been passed said that domestic violence has occurred and will occur in the future. I said, no, you can't put that in there because no one knows what's going to happen in the future, but it may occur in the future. If it does, it may occur in the future, then the judge has to, in his discretion, the power to issue a restraining order. Some of the legislators fought it, but that became law. And I was gratified about so many years after that. It was passed in 1991. I guess it would have been about 2010. That provision was challenged by somebody as being too vague. And so therefore they tried, and the Legal Aid Society of Gwinnett County, in that particular case, appealed it to the Court of Appeals when a judge refused to issue an order. And the judge and the Court of Appeals upheld that language. Well, the solid law since 2010, before that it was guidance for any judge hearing a domestic violence matter. And I'm still very active. The Women's Resource Center treated me very well. They gave me several awards for the work I've done on behalf of domestic violence, against domestic violence, including what they call the Clarence Seeliger Award. It's given every year by the Women's Resource Center to those who have worked hard to fight the scourge of domestic violence. Honored by that, they give it out every year. Haven't done it the last 2 years because we haven't been gathering because of fires. But it's still there.
Scroll through some more because I want to leave time at the end for questions. But one last thing. If anyone is interested in Judge Seeliger's barbecue sauce recipe, that is now available with your smartphone or created his own barbecue sauce. He said he didn't remember the year, and there is no year, unfortunately, on this. But it looks delicious, and it's just in time for lunch. So I thought we can end with that. This is a screenshot of the website. You can, again, call me, email me. I left cards on the back table so you can come and see the collection. histories of Judge Seeliger. We also have his collection, as I mentioned, 33 document boxes, 25 scrapbooks. So please call us, email me. Now, we have about 10 minutes left at the end here, and there's a microphone that around. So if anybody has questions for Judge Seeliger, I'm sure he'd love to answer questions.
Thank you for your talk. As someone who was, what gave you that gumption and that make those decisions that you felt were right? And by the way, thank you for doing so.
Yeah, are you talking about the Confederate flag?
That's one thing that comes to mind exactly. And whatever happened with that flag, by the way?
I think it was returned to Judge Mitchell. I'm not sure. That was a strange story. I got elected, and I already had made one change. It's hard to, I'm sure some of you may remember, but what DeKalb County was like in 1980. In DeKalb County, all the judges were white and male. In DeKalb County, all court staff, clerks and his staff that worked at the clerk's office of the state court or the superior court or the probate court were all white. And there once in a while would be a temporary bailiff in the superior court who come in to help with security, but all the bailiffs were white. The bailiff is the person who actually runs the courtroom on behalf of the judge, keeps order in the court, swears the witnesses and the like. So I hired Nesby Thomas, who had worked at his son and he had both worked on my campaign, a tall, dignified African-American man. He was a great guy. He passed away about a year ago. He was a great help to me. He gave me great advice. I really miss him. But anyway, I appointed him as the bailiff. And so when I went into the courtroom for the first time, I noticed that there were two what I thought were Georgia flags. So remember, the Georgia flag at that time had the stars and bars on it. So I didn't think much of it. And then I went back and had to go in the courtroom to get something off the bench. And I looked around and the flags were there, but one looked different. And I looked carefully at it. And one was a Confederate battle flag. I didn't know quite what to think. Later found out that it belonged to J. Oscar Mitchell himself. He used to drape it over the entrance of his courtroom on Robert E. Lee's birthday Confederate. I think that included, there's a courtroom at the other end of this building, and it's a Schuster gatherings now, and not as a courtroom, but it used to be Judge Mitchell's courtroom initially, before they moved down to a building on the other side of what we call the 1968 courthouse. That's where he's looking at me, that's where he draped them. And the state court moved into what we call the new courthouse, the 1968 courthouse. He brought it with him. And he left it in Jack Smith's courtroom. And that was the courtroom I inherited when Jack Smith became the senior judge upon the defeat of Judge Mitchell. So I was in there. And I don't think Jack ever knew that the flag had been in there. But anyway, there it was. So I knew it had to go. So the next morning, I ran into a newspaper reporter, Will Spalding, who was with the Atlanta Journal, and I said, look, if there's a Confederate flag in my courtroom, I'm going to remove it. I just wanted to let you know. He said, well, I don't think that's much of a story. He said, I don't either, but, you know, it indicates there's some changes going on at DeKalb County. He said, all right, I'll be there. So when I went out on the on the bench, there was a arraignment day, and about 80% of the people there were African American. I addressed them, I said, look, the Confederate flag used to be a flag of honor, but now it represents an attitude toward race, and as such should not be in any courtroom anywhere. I'm directing my bailiff to remove the flag from my courtroom. And Nesby walked over, grabbed the flag, he walks over across. That was the end of what I thought, and then The reporter came back and said, "Do you have anything else you want to say?" "No, that's all I wanted to say." He said, "Okay. Well, he said, I'm going to turn it in. I don't think there'll be much done with it. I'm going off to Canada. I'm on vacation." He said, "Okay, we'll have a good time." Then I went to lunch after the cattle call completed. And I came back out in the elevator, and there was this young black man with cameras, all kinds of cameras. My smart legal mind deduced that he must be a photographer. Anyway, I asked him, he came up to me and said, "Are you Judge Seeliger?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I took a picture of the Confederate flag with your bailiff, Mr. Thomas. Was that okay?" And I said, "Okay, that's fine." And didn't think much of it. As I turned away and said, "Fine," he turned to me and he said, "Judge?" I said, "Yes." I swear there was a tear in his eye. He said, "Thank you." And that's when I started to realize there might be more to this than I thought. Well, anyway, the next day, the paper came out, and the Atlanta Journal, which at that time was an archival newspaper. The headline said, "New Judge Removes Confederate Battle Flag." New DeKalb Judge removes Confederate Battle Flag. It's on the front page, above the floor, and there's a picture of Nesby on the flag. Things were kind of peaceful that afternoon. Not many people saw it in the afternoon newspaper. The next morning, it started. The calls. Then that headline plus that picture was placed, was sent all over the country in a magazine called Thunderbolt, Marietta Thunderbolt, run by J.B. Stoner out in Marietta, a racist newspaper, and it was sent out everywhere. So I started receiving hate mail from all over the country. And they also thoughtfully put my name, home address, and my home telephone number on the front page of that paper. Now, the calls kept coming in, started coming in, and they'd call all day, all night. My wife was kind of upset about it. She didn't understand what all the hubbub was, and I didn't either, and I didn't try to explain, but these people just keep calling. Finally, one guy called at 3 o'clock in the morning. My wife was on the side of the bed with the phone. She answered the phone and said, "Hello?" And she turned to me and said, "Chuck, it's one of your friends again." Handed me the phone. I said, "Hello?" And then he started to cuss me out. And I finally said, "All right, I'll hear what you have to say, but what's your name?" So I'm not giving you mine. And he said, "Well, if you haven't got guts enough to tell me your name, I don't want to hear what you're saying." All right. For a reason, calls stopped calling quite as often. He still happened at the office. The hate mail was voluminous, and they counted the collections by year back, including a death threat. Because a lot of these calls went on out to the west coast of the places where the Aryan nations were formulating their racist organization. This was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And one of those members threatened to lynch me, sent a postcard to that effect, and signed his name. And I turned that one over to the FBI, and he was prosecuted. That's what happened with the flag.
Thank you, Judge. Any other questions?
Can you tell about the election you ran against hospital?
Well, you should know. You were there. I really appreciate you coming over to the headquarters from time to time. It was a strange campaign. But anyway, I would announce against J. Oscar Mitchell, and it was going to be kind of a real surprise to a lot of people. Judge Mitchell had served for 20 years at that point. He was famous because he's the judge who put Martin Luther King in Greaseville Penitentiary for 4 months for driving with an out-of-state driver's license. He was in prison for 4 days until finally, after being prevailed upon by the Kennedy presidential campaign, this was in 1960, to intervene and grant an appeals bond, which by the way, Dr. King was entitled to as a matter of right. If you're charged with a misdemeanor, you have an automatic right to an appeal bond, but Judge Mitchell wouldn't set the bond. But finally he did. And that's how case was appealed to the Court of Appeals, and they threw out the conviction and the probation revocation. Now, that was the man I would be running against. He had abused a client of mine. I had a young black woman named Brenda White, who was charged with welfare fraud. It was going to be the first case to be prosecuted in the state of Georgia because the law had been passed against welfare fraud just the previous session of the legislature. So I got the case, and I met with Brenda. Brenda was 21 years old, had 2 kids. She wasn't getting any support from the fathers of the children. So she was getting what we called AFDC in those days, Aid for Dependent Children. And she had a job at that time as a server in a barbecue joint. But then she got a new job working for the state in Dunwoody for the Center for, it was basically for retarded people. It was an institute up in Dunwoody, and she was working as one of the caretakers. So she got that job, and she experienced an increase in pay. There's no question about it. And she signed affidavits saying that she's still getting the pay she got when she was working in the barbecue joint. Well, about 6 months, she got away with it, and then they caught her. The state of Georgia paid her, I think, $600 more than they should have paid her. They decided to prosecute. So, Mary Whiteman was one of the lawyers in my office, and I asked her if she would help. I said I had to go off to Seattle for some reason, family reason. So I went off to Seattle, and I asked her to investigate and look into it. She did a great job. She looked into it, saw what happened, confirmed with the evidence that the state had against him, but also negotiated a plea. It'd be a plea, and a nolle contendere plea. She'd agree to pay the restitution, and she wouldn't have a criminal record. To continue treatment, the state would get their money back, and everybody would be happy. So we're to appear before Judge Mitchell at 10 o'clock that morning. The next morning, not the next morning, but about 2 weeks later. They were scheduled by then at 10 o'clock. Kind of weird, because normally criminal calendars were on Mondays in the state court. So I went there at 10 o'clock for this, whatever, must be some sort of ceremony. So I went in there, we tendered a plea, and the state made their recommendation, and Judge Mitchell was ready to pronounce sentence. Before he could pronounce sentence, he proceeded to berate my client. Went after her, immediately said, didn't use the word, and please forgive me for using it. Didn't use the word nigger, but used her in everything else you can think of. Welfare queens, you people down there, driving up to the welfare office in your Cadillacs and get your welfare money. Went on and on and on for about a minute, this tirade. And I turned to look at my client. She was shaking in tears. He's a big, mean son of a bitch. Really, it was. And I turned and looked at him. He looked at me. Something passed between us. I don't know what it was, but I was really upset. Then Mary, being the take charge lawyer she said, Brenda, come on, let's go over to court. I went out and sat in the hallway. I was just stunned by what the judge had said. And a reporter came up, Joe Ledley from the Atlanta Journal. And he said, Chuck, I want to ask you about what happened today. I said, well, I told him my advice, and I said, and I thought it was a fair result, but I don't think the judge should have said what he said. And so, by the way, why are you here? Why are we covering this? This is a misdemeanor. He said, well, Judge Mitchell called us and said he wanted to make a statement against welfare fraud. He's up for re-election. And I realized what had happened. Judge Mitchell beat up my client to make a political point. And I was really enraged at that. And 6 years later, I would run against him. So he was a part of what was commonly referred to as the courthouse gang. And lawyers, the Bar Association, old line lawyers and judges who pretty much controlled the judiciary and the court system in DeKalb County for generations. And he was one of the leaders. He'd been a judge at that time for 30 years. So when I announced I was running, nobody was particularly concerned. This kid lawyer, 39 years old, from Seattle, Washington, didn't stand a chance. In the process, a lot of young lawyers who had been abused by Judge Mitchell decided they'd help him in the campaign, and it included Wayne Purdom and Susan Purdom. Wayne and Susan, well, she called herself Susan Ellis at that time, worked on the campaign, and Wayne, after I won the election, he would become chief judge of the state court of DeKalb County. And it was Byron Wyndham. He practiced law in Decatur. I'd known him before. He worked in the campaign, working on signs primarily, campaign signs and putting them out. And he retired just recently as a lawyer, as a real estate lawyer up in North Georgia. Then there was Robert Waller, who was a law student. He was teaching school. We're going to downtown law school. He'd already got a bachelor's degree, but then he went to law school, and he helped out on the campaign. And he's now chief judge of the juvenile court in Gwinnett County. So I have these, and I think Ron Jason, wonderful guy, hardworking guy. He's the guy who drafted the campaign commercial we did. We did a campaign commercial, believe it or not, and the like. And helped draft a lot of the press releases and the brochures we put together. And we had a lot of volunteers. The League of Women Voters got involved because they are reform-minded, and I told them I'd like to make some reforms. So a lot of the members of the league started working in the campaign. They would sign postcards and letters for the campaign, do things like that. At the same time, another fellow by the name of Jim Goggins, a really nice guy, he's a lawyer, also got in the campaign. And so there were the two of us and Oscar Mitchell. Oscar Mitchell didn't take anything very seriously. But when we got to the primary night, Judge Mitchell got 46% of the vote. I got 43% of the vote. Jim Goggins got the balance, 9 or 10%. Bad news for Judge Mitchell. Because in Georgia, you have to have a majority in order to win. So that meant he was thrown into a runoff with me. So, and I'd done pretty well. I had 43% of the vote, he had 46. But the axiom is, if you're an incumbent and you're running in a primary and you get the kind of vote you get in the primary is what you're going to get in the general. You're not going to get an increase. So, he started campaigning. I spent a total of $30,000 on the campaign. Most of that was my own money. Folks had passed away about a year before, and I decided I'd take part of that money and use that to run the campaign. Oscar raised close to $100,000 in a week, and he put on television ads, ran direct mail, did all the things you should do. He should have been doing it the first time around, but didn't do. At the end of the election, I won. I won by 56% of the vote. And this wonderful lady from Decatur and several others were one of the people who did that volunteer work. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Judge. We'll end there, and I thank you, Judge Seeliger, for coming back to the History Center and talking to us about your career, your work, and election. And I thank all of you for coming in person, and thank all of you for watching out there. We really appreciate your support. Thanks, everybody.